Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back on the episode of Way of the Underhive. This series is dedicated to helping brand new players to Necromunda build their starting rosters and learn more about the game mechanics of their favorite gangs. And on this episode, we will discuss playing a Slave Ogryns gang for your campaigns of Necromunda Ash Wastes. We'll be discussing their strengths, their weaknesses, their fighters, their playstyles, and provide critical information that you can use in your campaign, and at the same time provide 3 starting rosters at 1,400 points that you can use in your very first campaign. So you want to play Slave Ogryns of the Ash Waste, do you? Well, that's good because this video is for you. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started by talking about the strengths and weaknesses of playing a Slave Ogryns gang in the Ash Waste of Necromunda. So first of all, let's talk about the strengths of playing a Slave Ogryns gang for Necromunda Ash Waste. Now, their first strength is literally their strength. Strength 5 is pretty much standard for all the fighters in a Slave Ogryns gang. And plus, any weapon that you get will probably add at least, at a minimum, +1 strength to your attack characteristic, which means you'll be wounding on 2 up in most cases, 3 up in very rare situations for the most part. And another thing about Slave Ogryns is that they are literally tough. Toughness 5 is standard throughout the entire gang. Enemies will have to wound on a 5 up with most weapons against you. And of course, if they get any weapons, they're at least as tough as 5, which are not very many, maybe on a 4 up for the most part. So because of that, these high strength and high toughness will outclass most of the starting gangs that you might run across when you're going out to the Ash Waste. At the same time, one of their fighters, which is the Lobo Slave, cannot be pinned, which is absolutely fantastic. So if you really want to push that onward advancement to destroy your opponents, that Lobo Slave cannot be underestimated. At the same time, with the Ash Waste rules, you now have access to vehicles, and those vehicles can shore up a lot of weaknesses in a Slave Ogryns gang, because for one, you can equip heavy weapons on vehicles, so that's going to really help out with the Slave Ogryns' lack of shooting. At the same time, also gives them speed, which of course Slave Ogryns are notoriously slow gangs, so that higher speed will help out in all kinds of things. And perhaps the most underestimated, probably the golden core reason why playing a Slave Ogryns gang in the Ash Waste campaign is great, is because you'll rarely hear any whining from the balance bandwagon. Potentially. Most people in the balance bandwagon have no issue with Slave Ogryns gangs. I think it's because Slave Ogryns gangs have so many handicaps on them that people don't whine about them as much. So because of that, you don't have to worry about hearing the whining and moaning and bemoaning of the balance bandwagon. That is, of course, unless you start winning. Then prepare yourself to hear all kinds of how overpowered Slave Ogryns really are. So now that we're done talking about the strengths, let's talk about the weaknesses of playing a Slave Ogryns gang. First of all, you have very few fighters in a Slave Ogryns gang, you have very few weapon options, and you have very, very few equipment and war gear options as well. At the same time, status effect weapons like Radphage and Blaze, for example, can be exceptionally devastating to a Slave Ogryns gang because those actually go past your wound characteristics and potentially put your fighters out of action as well. At the same time, as a Slave Ogryns gang, you're always going to be outnumbered, and at the same time, you're always going to be outgunned as well by your opponents, so you do have to worry about that. And because of that, you also have to worry about campaign handicaps. Things like the runaway special rule, for example, your fighters, if they get captured, your enemies will sell them to guilders for d6 times 10 credits, but because they're runaway slaves, they earn additional d6 times 10 credits on top of that. So potentially up to 120 credits being sold to your fighters, so that part is pretty devastating as well. At the same time, the rules are kind of vague about getting new fighters in your gang for replacing them, whether it's a Lobo Slave or a Slave Ogryns, so you do have to worry about that as well. Like I said, there's a lot of weaknesses of playing a Slave Ogryns gang, and that's probably why the balance bandwagon doesn't really give you a lot of crap about it. So now that we're done talking about the strengths and weaknesses of playing a Slave Ogryns gang for the Ash Waste, let's talk about their fighters. So up first, let's talk about the Ogryn Overboss, which is the leader of your gang. This fighter costs 145 credits. They have a movement characteristic of 5 inches, a 3+ weapon skill, 5+ ballistic skill, 5 strength and toughness. They also have 3 wounds. They also have, incredibly enough, a 3-up initiative. They're actually quite flexible and speedy for an Ogryn. They also have 8+ leadership, 5+ cool, 9+ willpower, as well as 8+ intelligence. Now, they do come away with the runaway special rule, which means that they get captured and get captive, they will be sold to the guilders for additional d6 times 10 credits, so you do have to worry about that. At the same time, for their skills, they do have brawn as well as leadership and muscle skills as their primaries, with combat as well as ferocity for their secondaries as well. Now, in this situation, they are the toughest and strongest close combat fighters in the game so far, and I recommend you equip them as such. With that strength 5, toughness 5, they're going to pretty much one-shotting your opponents pretty easily. If you want to give them like a super heavy weapon, like a super heavy augmetic weapon, for example, that's just icing on the cake. And so because of that, you can really tear them up, especially against enemy vehicles now, since you got to worry about the higher toughness of enemy vehicles as well. Now, for shooting for these guys as well, they also have a really good shooting weapons for Ogryns in the terms of grenades. Slave Ogryn Overbosses have access to blasting charges, demo charges, frag grenades, incendiary charges, as well as crack grenades. In my opinion, the best weapons to use for you will be the blasting charges, because they have those 5-inch blast radius with a higher strength and damage over a frag grenade, or incendiary grenades, because you can set people on fire with the incendiary grenade as well. And like I said, oddly enough, they actually have a really good initiative check with a 3-up on initiative. That'll make it excellent for boarding enemy vehicles, so you can that way you can board enemy vehicles and fight on there and, you know, slice some of your guys that way as well. So this is the overview that we have for the Ogryn Overboss. Up next is the Ogryn Underboss, which is your champion. This fighter costs 110 credits. For their stats, they got 5-inch movement, 3+ weapon skill, 5+ ballistic skill, 5 strength and toughness, 3 wounds, 4+ initiative, 2 attacks. They have 8+ leadership, 7+ cool, 9+ willpower, as well as 9+ intelligence. And they also come with the runaway special rule attached to them as well. For their primary skills are in brawn as well as in muscle, while they have combat, ferocity, as well as leadership for their secondary. Now, just like their leader, the Overboss, the Underboss is actually an excellent close combat fighter as well. With that 5 strength and 5 toughness, it's going to be really tough to beat them, and plus they can pound their enemies into the ground. That 3-up weapon skill is really nice as well. Now, they do have a ballistic skill. They do have access to grenades as well, things like blasting charges, demo charges, frag grenades, incendiary charges, as well as crack grenades, but they got that 5-up ballistic skill, which is kind of a problem. So be wary, because if you miss your throw, it could bounce back and, you know, blow you up your own guys, so keep that in mind. I highly recommend putting incendiary charges on these guys for that blaze effect for the most part, because that could really help you out. Now, granted, you could accidentally hit your own people with that, but it could easily be solved by giving your guys hazard suits in order to stop that from happening. Blasting charges are also a really good one, because it could really cause major explosions and really tear it up as well. Now, unfortunately, for being a champion, they do have some pretty terrible psychology stats. Their cool is a 7+. And it's average, don't get me wrong, it's average, but a lot more champions and a lot of different gangs have a higher cool than that, so plan accordingly. You can send these guys in for it if you want to by themselves, but I highly recommend you put someone with them. If not, keep them next to your Overboss, so that way they got a little bit buff to their cool statistic for the most part. From there, we have the Slave Ogryns, which is your ganger level fighter. This fighter costs 90 credits. For their stats, they have a 5-inch movement, 4+ weapon skill, 5+ ballistic skill, 5 strength, 5 toughness, 2 wounds, 4 initiative, 2 attacks. They have 8+ leadership, 7+ cool, 9+ willpower, as well as 9+ intelligence. Now, unfortunately, they do have some pretty messed up special rules. First of all, they have loyal, which basically states that Ogryns are very loyal creatures and form strong bonds with those they live and fight with. Whenever a friendly fighter makes a close combat attack, claims and assists with this fighter, that fighter adds +2 to the result of any hit rolls rather than usual ones. So that part's kind of nice, because it can really help you up to gang up on your enemies. However, you're not really going to be ganging up on your enemies too often per se, because you don't have very many fighters in your gangs, but keep that in mind. Now, there is some negatives to this. Once again, they have the runaway skill, again, a runaway special rule against them, so they will get additional D6 credits for your enemies if they get sold. But you also have what's called a limited learning capacity. The fighter with this special rule can spend experience and gain advances as a normal for a ganger, but they cannot become a specialist. Should this fighter roll a 2 or 12 and rolling on the advanced table, they must instead choose any other result on that table. So that part's kind of sad as well. At the same time, they cannot learn any skills whatsoever. I think it has to go with the fact that they are limited in their learning capacity, so because you don't have any access for the skills of these guys. And at the same time, the only skill they do come with is headbutt. That's pretty much it. So, with that being said, they're also one of the only few fighters in gangs that can bring guns to a gunfight. That's pretty much true on that one, because for their starting rosters, they do have Storm Welders, what is the only range weapon, like in terms of a gun, that they can actually use. Now, they do have access to demo charges, as well as crack grenades, as always, but at that same time, though, only having that Storm Welder could be a problem. Now, I did find a workaround in order to get around this, and I call this the stash exploit, and I'll talk about that later on when we get to the exploit portion of this video, about how you can equip your Slave Ogryns with better weapons as well. Now, they do have pretty good stats, but they can still be pinned, making them less attractive as their Lobo Slave counterparts, because Lobo Slaves cannot be pinned. And we're going to talk about those fighters next. Alright, so let's talk about the Lobo Slave. There's another ganger level fighter that costs 70 credits apiece. They have 4-inch movement, 4+ weapon skill, 6+ ballistic skill, 5 strength and toughness, 2 wounds, 5 initiative, 2 attacks. They have 5 leadership, 5 cool, 10 willpower, and 10 intelligence. Now, just like their regular Slave Ogryn counterparts, they do have limited learning capacity, so they can't learn any skills, and they can't also become they can't become specialists, so they do have that problem. They also have the runaway skill too, special ability, which also gives your opponents bonuses to selling them. But they also come with what comes with slow-witted. It says Ogryns are not especially bright or quick on the uptake, but monotask servitors are particularly dull-witted. This fighter may never be activated as part of a group activation, so they can't be activated in groups, which is another problem. But even though they have a lot of handicaps, there is one golden thing about them, and that is the lobotomized rule. A Lobo slave does not possess much in the way of personality and almost nothing in the way of self-preservation instincts. Such natural impulses have been sacrificed to increase their value as work units. When a fighter with this special rule is hit by ranged attacks, they do not become prone and pinned. However, a fighter with this special rule is unable to perform a take cover basic action. So that's the golden hallmark about the Lobo Slave. The Lobo Slave cannot be pinned, and because of that, it makes them unstoppable close combat fighters who can't be pinned, which makes them absolutely fantastic that way. My recommendation is to give them cheap melee weapons and charge them forward. And the reason why is because, yes, while augmatic weapons are really cool for Slave Ogryns, you're kind of wasting your money, your credits, on equipping your Lobo Slaves with those augmatic weapons. Just use the hand weapons. Axes, brute cleavers, mauls, spud jackers, two-handed axes, two-handed hammers. That's probably the best thing you want to give these guys for the most part. And the reason why is because you really don't want to spend all that expensive money on these guys, because these guys are probably going to get killed for the most part. Now, when it comes to their armor, I highly suggest you purchase hazard suits, because hazard suits will give you a 6-up armor save, which is, not that great. But what it does do, however, is protect you from status effect weapons like Radphage, Blaze, Toxin, Gas, all those things. And that's where the hazard suit really comes in. You're going to be putting these guys into harm's way quite a bit, so having those additional buffs to protect them from those weapons, extremely invaluable. So now that we're done talking about the fighters, let's talk about the exploits, specifically for the Ash Waste for your gang. I call this the Ash Waste Stash Exploit Part 1. Alright, so here's why. Now, the problem with most Slave Ogryn gangs is that they don't have access to good weapons and equipment because they only can pick weapons and equipment from their house rules, their house list when they're starting off. However, there is a way to work around this, and I call this the stash exploit. Your vehicle crews who drive your vehicles, these are the guys who are going to be using those exploits. They have access to pistols, things like auto pistols, last pistols, stub guns, and most importantly, hand flamers, and they also have access to war gear like photo goggles and respirators. What you could do is this, and this is kind of sneaky. You could purchase extra pistols and war gear for your hive scummers and scum racers and then place it in your stash. And then from your stash, you can move your gear from your stash and give it to your Ogryns. Alright, here's why. Technically speaking, you're not purchasing those items for your Slave Ogryns per se. What you're really doing is buying multiple things for your crew members, is what you actually do. But it just so happens you can move those items from your stash to your Ogryns if you want to. And this is what I like to call the stash exploit, by buying those gears, especially hand flamers if you want to get really good range attacks for your Slave Ogryns. And you just tell people, I'm not buying these for my Ogryns, I'm just buying these for my fighters. And I just put them in the stash, and then from the stash I can give it to whoever fighter I want to, because I can do that if I want. And that's pretty much how you can work on it from that. So that's part 1 of what I like to call the stash exploit. Now, continuing on with our Ash Waste exploits, we have the Stash Exploit Part 2. This is option number 2. Option number 2 comes in the form of the Cargo 8 Ridge Hauler, alright? And perhaps maybe the Chronos Pattern Iron Crawler as well. I'm not sure if the Chronos Pattern Iron Crawler does Trading Run as of yet. I haven't found any information about that. But with the Trading Run special rule for these vehicles, the vehicle with assigned crew and cargo may take a trade post-battle action, just like a champion. So because of this, this will allow you to purchase additional weapons and war gear and place it directly into your stash. So if you buy those items, put it in the stash, move from the stash to your fighters, and repeat the same exploit as before. I highly suggest, if you want to do this, that you use either template weapons or shotguns of all variants to do so. A combat shotgun on a Slave Ogryn, for example, can be really devastating, especially if it's kind of like a Ripper gun that the Ogryns use for Warhammer 40k. You could use that as well, or you can move heavier weapons, or whatever the situation may be for your gang members, that way they can fight with those. Now, that is what I suggest, what I like to call the stash exploit, and this is using the Cargo 8 Ridge Hauler in order to do that. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about before we get to the actual list are suggested alliances that I recommend that you would take for your Slave Ogryns. Now, your Slave Ogryns are outlaws, which means that they can only make criminal alliances in your games of Necromunda. So if your campaign does allow for alliances, these are the criminal alliances I would suggest, and there are 3 of them. The first one I would suggest are the Cold Traders. Now, Cold Traders, of course, are an obvious choice for most criminal outlaw gangs just because of the fighters that they have, right? You got strong fighters Plus, they can give your Overboss a range Xenos weapon of some sort as well, because those ranged Xenos weapons are brought in as part of the Alliance of the Cold Traders. I either suggest a Necrotic Beamer, because you can use that for close combat and for short range shooting, a Rude Fusil, which can be used like a plasma gun, which is also kind of nice as well, or a sling gun. Those are all highly recommended in my opinion. So equip your Slave Ogryns Overboss with those weapons and let them cut loose and cause all kinds of problems. The only problem with taking a Cold Trader list, however, is Imperial Entanglements. One of your gang will have to go away, unless of course you want to test the Alliance, which could cause all kinds of problems for your gang because your gang's not very big to begin with. But you also have those 2 Hiveborn Scum. This could really help you out. Not Hiveborn Scum, sorry, Voidborn Scum, which could help you out. So it's not as bad as a handicap as it sounds, so you could do that. Another suggested alliance I recommend is the Rogue Factoria. The Rogue Factoria is kind of cool because you could equip your fighters with counterfeit weapons, and those counterfeit weapons could be quite good and useful for Slave Ogryns game. Now granted, they do have the Reckless of trait attached to them, but for a game that can't normally purchase range weapons, beggars really can't be choosers in my opinion. At the same time, you also have a nice nest of expendable fighters in the form of the work party that you can throw at your enemies and let them get sacrificed and keep your more important Ogryn fighters alive. Now, the last alliance I would also suggest are Naaargah Lords. Now, the Naaargah Lords are good. I mean, it's a decent alliance, and if you want to give your gang narcotics to use for your gang, it could be kind of cool as well. But the main reason why you want to make an alliance with Naaargah Lords is not so much the narcotics, but for the D3+2 Hive Scum that you can recruit every battle. Now, that's the one that's going to really help you out as well. That's going to give you some much needed long-range shooting with last guns, auto guns, and grenades, and etc. So that could really help out your gang as well. So I suggest Cold Traders, Rogue Factoria, or Naaargah Lords. Those are probably the best alliances you can take for a Slave Ogryns gang, because they can shore up some of your weaknesses as well. So now that we're going to talk about alliances, let's talk about our starting lists. List number 1 is what I like to call the Fuel My Fire Slave Ogryns list. It's going to cost you 1,400 credits in order to field this group. It consists of your Slave Ogryns Overboss. Is going to cost you 280 credits. They're equipped with an armored undersuit as well as furnace plates to give them that 4-up, 5-up armor save. They're also armed with an arc welder for blaze, a spud jacker for a backup weapon, as well as an incendiary charges to lob flaming grenades, and they have iron will to help out with that +1 to cool test. Bottle test, which will be really helpful for you as well. After that, you got 2 Ogryn Underbosses. Both of them cost you 230 credits apiece. They're both equipped exactly the same. Both have furnace plates, both have last cutters, both have incendiary charges, and both have the Naaargah skill as well. That Naaargah skill is going to really help you out in case if your Underboss gets pinned, they can stand back up and still perform a charge action in close combat with using that Naaargah skill with their last cutters, or start lobbing incendiary charges to cause problems. After that, you got 3 Lobo Slaves. All 3 cost 110 credits apiece. All 3 are equipped exactly the same with hazard suits as well as paired Spud Jackers. They're going to use those Spud Jackers to rain death on your enemies in close combat. At the same time, if your incendiary charges go wayward and hit one of your friendly fighters, the hazard suit for the Lobo Slave will keep them from being blazed. Now, for your vehicle, you're going to be having a Scum Racer. It's going to cost you 330 credits. This character is driving a heavy custom vehicle that's tracked with a harpoon launcher. They also got nitro burners for +1 to that speed, as well as tire claws for better handling. And this is what I like to call the Fuel My Fire Slave Ogryns list. Now let's talk about the gang's overview now that we're done talking about its contents. This gang is pretty straightforward: charge towards your enemy, dismount, and attack. There's nothing fancy about it. 3 members of this gang are equipped with incendiary charges, so you can set your enemies on fire. From there, you can charge in and finish them off in close combat. Your Lobo Slaves can't be pinned, so don't be afraid to send them in to cause all kinds of problems for your enemies, and their hazard suits will also protect them from being set on fire from friendly fire as well. Now, the Slave Ogryns Overboss's Iron will assist with bottle checks due to the small size of your gang. At the same time, your Underbosses can exploit their Naaargah skills to get charged into close combat, even when they are pinned. So it's very, very aggressive, very, very brutal. This is the Fuel My Fire list. Now, list number 2 is what I like to call the Chainbreaker Slave Ogryns list. It's going to cost you 1,400 credits. Now, for this one, you got Ogryns Overboss, cost you 360 credits. They have armored undersuit as well as mesh armor, giving them that 4-up, 3-up armor save. They got twin arc wielders as well to cause brutal close combat attacks. They have blasting charges as well as incendiary charges, so that way they can throw mixed fruit and blow stuff up. And they have the walk it off skill in order to help them out in case they get one in close combat. Now, your Slave Ogryns Underboss, you only got one of these guys. It costs you 220 credits. This person's got furnace plates as well as paired automatic fists for a knockback and close combat lulls. He's also got blasting charges as well as a Naaargah skill. And then you have 2 Slave Ogryns. Ogryn number 1 is going to cost you 185 credits. They're equipped with a furnace plate as well as storm welder and a spud jacker. Ogre number 2 is going to cost you 130 credits. They got Furnace Players as well as a Spud Jacker and a Boot Cleaver for close combat. And you have one Lobo Slave at 130 credits. They have Furnace Plates, a two-handed hammer, as well as a Stim Slug Stash for obvious reasons. And then you got your Scum Racer, going to cost you 375 credits. This person's armed with photo goggles so that way they can see where they're going. You're also given them a medium custom vehicle that's tracked to make them a little bit more faster. They also have a harpoon launcher, smoke vents for minus 1 to shoot against, tire claws for better handling, nitro burners for additional speed. It's got a ram so that way you can cause all kinds of problem, as well as a transport ped to transport your troops. And this is what they call the Chain Breakers Slave Ogryns gang. So now that we're talking about the contents of the gang, let's talk about its overview real quick. So this gang is pretty straightforward. Zoom straight towards the enemy in your custom media vehicle and engage the enemy. The blasting charges should rain destruction upon your enemies, allowing you to assault forward with the rest of your gang. At the same time, Ogre number 1 and Scum Racer should engage enemies from fire from the vehicle with their Storm Wielder as well as their harpoon launcher. Meanwhile, the Ogre Overboss and Ogre number 2 form one assault team, while your Ogre Underboss and your Lobo Slave form a second fire team, both teams sweeping for other sides of the flanks and finish off your enemies. And that's pretty much how this list works. Pretty simple, to the point, and keep it snappy. Now the last list number 3, is what I like to call the Blighted Kings Naaargah Corrupted Slave Ogryns gang at 1,400 credits. Now your Ogryn Overboss is going to cost you 235 credits, armed with armored undersuit and furnace plates. They got a two-handed axe as well as blasting charges. They also got +1 wound due to Naaargah's blessing as well as commanding presence for larger group activation. Your Ogryn Underboss is going to cost you 195 credits. They got an armored undersuit as well as furnace plates. They also got paired axes as well as blasting charges and bull charge. Your second Ogryn Underboss and cost you 235 credits. This fighter's got armor undersuit as well as furnace plates. They got a last cutter as well as blasting charges and the Naaargah skill. Out of that, you got your first Ogryn. It's going to cost 180 credits. This guy's got a Storm Wielder as well as a Spud Jacker, and you got two Lobo Slaves. Lobo Slave number 1 costs 105 credits, armed with a Boot Cleaver as well as a Spud Jacker, and Lobo Slave number 2 costs 105 credits, armed with a two-handed hammer. And then lastly, your vehicle is going to be a Guild of Coin Hauler for 345 credits. They're going to be equipped with a Cargo 8 Ridge Hauler, a Munitorium Armor Container, as well as smoke vents. And that makes it what I like to call the Blighted Kings Naaargah Corrupted Slave Ogryns gang. So once again, for the overview on this one, it's a real simple build for this gang. You charge forward, you destroy your enemy. The Blessing of Naaargah should make it more difficult for your enemies to put your fighters out of action because you can reroll wounds, at the same time give one additional wound to your leader as well. Use your Cargo 8 Ridge Hauler to keep your fighters protected until you close the distance, and then from there, have your fighters just dismount, charge forward, and destroy. At the same time, the Munitorium Armor Container should help with ammo checks for your blasting charges. This vehicle will also increase additional credits and exploit the stash mechanic that we talked about earlier to get combat shotguns and flamers for your gang. Use the blasting charges for your Overboss and Underboss to suppress your enemies, and send the rest of your fighters to engage your enemy and destroy. So in conclusion, the Slave Ogryns gang is a strong, resilient, and a blast to play, quite literally, especially if you equip your guys with blasting charges. Now, I would not recommend a Slave Ogryns gang to a novice player. I would not recommend it just because of all the handicaps they have. But if you're a novice player, or if you just like the challenge, then go ahead and do so, because there should be all kinds of fun. And like I said, of course, perhaps the best part about playing a Slave Ogryns gang is that you're pretty much safe from the balance bandwagon to complain about the gang that you're taking due to the difficulty of playing such a gang. That is, of course, unless you start winning, then prepare to hear how overpowered Slave Ogryns are. So that being said, you guys, that's good for this one. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.